coffee, big cup, and hello. Welcome back to another episode of the Gilmore Way Podcast. If you were here the last couple weeks, you'll know that we're shaking things up a little with how we're doing things around here. Instead of following the series and pulling out themes on topics from the episodes we're discussing, we're moving to thematic only, and we're going to go much deeper into the topics we've been wanting to talk about and releasing longer series of episodes about them so that we don't have to cram so much discussion into 90 minutes. This will mean shorter episodes and more focused, fulsome discussions about the juiciest subjects.
This week will be part 1 on our series of the sex politics of Gilmore Girls. We're going to kick off this discussion with a look at the treatment of teens and sex on the show, and the frankly super problematic messaging about sexual morality aimed largely at teen girls. Before we get started, this is your regular reminder that we are a spoilers all podcast, and we'll definitely be giving away some pretty major plot points. So if you don't want to know, you may want to click off and catch up before coming back for this discussion. And if you could quickly do those YouTube-y things for us, like this video, subscribe, share with your friends, or even leave a comment, we would be really grateful. That support really does help us out. I want to kick off this episode by just reminding ourselves of it, but reminding the viewer that this was a show that came out of funding from a family-friendly programming forum, which, I want to go over what that program and what that network was trying to put forth in terms of content, because whether they hit or missed the mark with the sex portion of Gilmore Girls, it's at least worth, I think, starting there.
Right. Obviously, it lays a lot of context to start here. So basically, it was a coalition of advertisers who put out a bunch of money to increase the amount of family-friendly programming on U.S. television. Their definition of family-friendly, air quotes, bunny ears, is it's relevant to today's TV viewer, has generational appeal, check, depicts real life and is appropriate in theme, whatever appropriate means, I guess, content and language for a broad family audience, and family-friendly programs also embody a responsible resolution. Once again, vague and a little terrifying. Family-friendly programs may include movies, dramas, situation comedies, and informational programs. And so some of the ones that stand out to me, like there's a bunch on this list that I'm like, I don't really know much about it, but a couple that stand out, like Gilmore Girls is at the top of the list. It was one of the first ones, I think, that they sort of backed. Ugly Betty, Friday Night Lights, New Adventures of Old Christine, 8 Simple Rules for Dating My Teenage Daughter, stuff like that. And the one thing I found interesting was that apparently the fund had no influence on the direction of the show after the pilot. So it was mostly just like a pilot funding program.
Which is still interesting, though, because in the pilot, we kick things off with, I was a mom at 16. I'm 32 now. Here's my 16-year-old daughter. We right away introduced teenage pregnancy, obviously stemming from Lorelai having a very healthy and promiscuous sex life as a teenager. But this is a family-friendly pilot? Like, how did that get approved? Or how did they push that through? What did Amy do to have him buy in?
Yeah, it's interesting. And we'll get more into it in terms of, it kind of subtly implies that, like, having a baby is better than not having a baby when you're a teenager, as if there's no other option for you.
None whatsoever.
Yeah. The other thing that gets me about it is the fact that in the pilot, there's the joke about Lorelai offering to do the principal to get Rory into Chilton. And I'm like, how did that fly?
Again, I'm at a loss.
Yeah. It's a whole thing.
Yeah.
But the way the show handles sex on the whole is interesting. And there are lots of different areas we're going to dive into over the next 3 episodes. We're going to talk about the quote unquote loss of virginity, virtue, and, consent, one night stands, sex positivity, Miss Patty.
Oh.
So buckle up. I'm Patty for 3 episodes for sure of sexy times. But the other place I wanted to kind of lead off this discussion from was a reminder that Amy Sherman-Palladino got her start on Roseanne back when she was still Amy Sherman. And one of the first big things she was recognized for, I think she joined the crew, the writing room in season 3 or 4, and she was a co-writer on season 4, episode 1, which is called The Bitter Pill to Swallow. And it's a birth control plotline where 17-year-old Becky wants to get birth control because, you know, we find out, spoilers for a show from like, what, 1992, that she's been having sex with her boyfriend and she wants birth control as extra protection. And I actually was able to find the whole episode online and watch the whole thing. And it was a trip. Did you watch it? I put the link in our like notes.
I did watch it. First off, the wrench metaphor. I think like I just want to use that in real life from now on. As problematic as it is, it made me think of like another reference where it's like once the car leaves the lot, there's a depreciation in value. And I feel like that's what Dan was going for here, you know, with the wrench metaphor. And I'm like, that's not great, but still very comedic.
Yeah. For those who haven't seen the episode, the wrench metaphor refers to Becky's boyfriend is helping Dan in his mechanic shop working on motorcycles. And he's like, this is a brand new wrench, never been touched. And you just use it and toss it aside. It's mine. It's my wrench. And I'm like, oh, yeah. Patriarchy.
Yeah, I mean, it got me chuckling just because I think, again, it's funny, but it's also like frightening at the same time.
Yeah. Part of it was the delivery. John Goodman.
Yeah,
is,
I mean, he's
awesome.
Just amazing. But it also, I think, is unfortunately truthful as to how fathers can view their daughters in that way, where it's like, how dare you take her chastity and her virtue? Like, you know, he says in the episode when he finds out, like, he's like, oh, I'm going to go kill him. It's fine.
Yeah, there's a whole scene where he, like, you're only seeing him from, like, the legs down, and then you see him pick up, like, a power wrench, like a pneumatic wrench, and it kind of makes it look like he's going to whack him. But instead, he just sort of, like, pulls the trigger on it, and it makes a scary noise, and it makes him jump. Mm-hmm. So, and then that's just before he gets into the wrench metaphor. But yeah, the whole episode it feels very Amy Sherman Palladino. There's even a moment where I feel like I watched the show in the past, but I'm not 100% of who Crystal is. I think she's like some sort of friend or family member of some sort. So Crystal has a baby and she's breastfeeding this baby in the kitchen, and Dan walks in and he's like, whoa, and he can't look down from the ceiling. Mm-hmm. So remind you of anyone?
Butch Danes, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, what a coinky dink. We have another one of those moments. I mean, granted, you know, in a way, it's like, that's not my wife. I shouldn't be gawking. But Roseanne sort of like follows him outside and is like, it's not like you've never seen breasts before.
Yeah, I mean, and there's a difference. Had he walked into the kitchen and it's been like, hello, you know, and started staring, like, super inappropriate. But you like all men, like, and women too, just acknowledge it. It's, you know, a normal part of life. We've been doing it since, you know, people existed. Breastfeeding is a norm. Like, the boobies are going to be there.
Get used to it. Yeah. I did still kind of appreciate, though, that his other daughter, Darlene, was trolling him and was like, Dad, quick, she's switching sides.
I gotta get out of here.
Darlene is, you know, yeah, she's Amy Sherman Palladino.
You know, there's a lot that can be said about it. What did you take away from Roseanne's response to how she handled her daughter coming to her with all of these things when the daughter was, I think, expecting, like, mom's just going to freak out and blow up on me?
Yeah, I think overall the show handled that really well. And, you know, Roseanne had a bit of a tough time with it, but Aunt Jackie was there to walk her through and be the voice of reason and be this sort of like buffer to reduce the awkwardness. And I like the scene where they're sitting in the gynecologist's office and Roseanne's kind of freaking out and she's like, you know, am I the only insane mom? And Jackie steps in and is like, I wish our mom had been more insane because I took a lot of stupid chances. And Roseanne also mentions to Dan when she comes to him about this, she's like, you know, our birth control wasn't so solid when we were first together. And, you know, Dan's like, oh, I feel like apologizing to your dad for ever having sex with you. And it's kind of funny, but it's poignant. It pulls at that thread of like, you know, we were once those stupid kids, right? Mm-hmm. And it, it kind of brings about that like hypocrisy of like, well, we were just like that. And, part of it is wanting to do better and to keep our kids safe, both physically and emotionally. But this show, I think, shows that the best way to do that is probably to actually like help them determine what that means and what it looks like instead of avoiding the subject altogether, and actually helping them, protect themselves in these situations.
Mm-hmm. And I think it was good too that she actually set her up with an appointment at the gynecologist. She could have just said, let me go buy you some rubbers, or I have extra birth control pills that I've used lying around. Like, I'll just, give you my, some of those, or without setting up an appointment as well. But she also, like, that's an important part of the health aspect and the sex aspect as well for, her daughter who is, having her first encounters with a guy. You need to take care of stuff. Like, so it's good that she followed up with saying like, yeah, we'll look into contraception for you, but also let's make sure you're physically healthy in that way.
Yeah, overall, I think it was good. And it was such a groundbreaking episode of TV for its time. A lot of sitcoms weren't tackling this, and definitely weren't tackling it in this sympathetic way. It was more like, oh, parents putting the fear of God into their kids. And so I think it sort of lays the groundwork for Amy's real feelings about the need for that sort of openness, and that, it's better to protect our kids with knowledge and with resources than it is to just sweep it under the rug. But, this was the early 90s. It was still a little ahead of its time. So let's fast forward a little bit to the 2000s and sort of like look at the cultural context there, because look at how we were treating women, and especially young women, young girls at the time. I think to the obsession with Britney's virginity and the whole like Justin and Britney thing, and him eventually outing having sex with her, and all of the new admissions in her latest memoir have really shown a light on how terrible we were to young girls in the early 2000s. It was just the sort of like post 90s third wave feminism where like you had to be sexy, but not too sexy. You had to be appealing to men, but don't ever have sex with them. Mm-hmm. It was just this horrible mishmash of messages that left young girls just totally adrift and living in a state of confusion and shame basically all the time.
Yeah. And it makes me think too of like even the amount of stores that were set up to try to cater to that demographic that maybe I don't think a lot of them exist anymore, but I think back to stores like Limited 2, BB, Forever 21, where it's like, we want you to have a cute top, have like, short shorts, buy it because that's how we want you to look. And that's what we think is appropriate. But then as soon as you actually put it on, I can't believe you're wearing shorts that are that high up, or like, look at that midriff. Like, do you know that like guys are just going to be like, thinking those thoughts now? It's like, but you're selling this product and then you shame me for wearing it.
Yeah. Girls were sold sex, but then also told that it was their job to maintain their own modesty and to regulate their own sex appeal. Like, God forbid the guys should control their own urges. It was all the girls' fault. Look at whose fashion choices were always policed in schools. And there you have it.
And it's the mantra that I think still exists today, where it's like, well, the man wouldn't be, behaving immodestly if you had just dressed appropriately. It's like, it does not work that way. Like, everyone across the board, control your urges, be respectful. But like, you can't just always put that blame on the woman in that regard. And that was what was happening very, very frequently.
Yeah. It's true. So it was such an interesting time, because a lot of the other TV shows that we saw in the early 2000s were hypersexualized. I'm thinking of The OC and One Tree Hill. I can't remember how much Dawson's Creek leaned into that, but it was probably an early example of that kind of teen drama where, there's all this focus on relationships and sex and all that kind of stuff. God, I wish I remembered, but this was like 20 years ago. So, ooh. And Gilmore really pushed back against it. I found the early 2000s, and obviously I'm not the only one who notices this. This is a pretty common knowledge at this point. There was a lot of girls putting down other girls, shaming women, shaming each other, catfights. girl on girl jealousy, fighting, all that kind of stuff. And Gilmore doesn't really lean into that too much. The only kind of example I can think of is Paris's interest in Tristan, who's interested in Rory, but it's not necessarily Paris and Rory fighting over Tristan. It's Paris's insecurity about the fact that he doesn't like her and likes someone else. And so she takes it out on Rory. It's kind of a different dynamic than we were used to seeing at that time in teen dramas. And Paris even calls it out in season 3 when they're pulled into the principal's office for their sniping at each other. And she's like, of course, we could only be fighting out about a boy, sexist, white-haired. That moment is just great. You know, it's aware of itself in that moment, that it doesn't lean into those tropes, and it doesn't over-sexualize its minor characters, except for Dean, which we'll get to later. But like the girls especially, you know, I think of the infamous Moo Moo from the first episode, and you know, the modest school uniforms and all of that. You know, it really kept that sort of like sexy teen dressing out of the show by putting the kids in uniforms. I think you see that a lot in the OC and some of those other shows. It's just like, wow, these girls are dressing provocatively, if you will. So Gilmore just avoided all of that. And I don't know if it's because of the family-friendly programming for him or because Amy Sherman-Palladino just wanted to do something different and didn't want to focus on that, you know? Teen sex wasn't a huge plot line until season 3 when they were like 18, except for Rory's dance. Like that's the only time where Rory's quote unquote sexuality sort of becomes an issue early on, up until the back half of season 3 when she's like, you know, close to going off to college and is technically an adult. And, you know, I think the Rory's dance scene is a lot about the deep wounds from Lorelai's teenage sexuality and how her parents felt about that, like quote unquote ruining her life. So yeah, Gilmore just sort of like, they steered away from it. There wasn't a ton of it up until like Swan Song.
But I'm actually really glad that they didn't just, you know, hit the viewer over the head with it right off the bat. I mean, we know that Lorelai comes in as, you know, I was a mom at 16. But we don't instantly get like you said, a plot line or any sort of arc with Rory and having sexual encounters, you know, wanting to explore that with, you know, the boyfriends that she has in her life. And I think it was just because she wasn't ready for it yet. When she eventually starts being ready to take those steps, and we'll get to that too, because there's a lot of issues there. You know, the show addresses it at the moment that Rory is coming into her own readiness for it. It didn't, you know, just say she's 16, so of course she's going to be having sex. That's what 16-year-olds do. Some do. Some are just, you know, maybe it's 17, maybe it's 18. There's not like an age marker that it's just like, oh, if you're not having sex in high school, prude. Like, no, like, you know, Rory needed to get to her own stage of readiness with it. And if that took until season 3, it took until season 3. And I'm glad that, again, Amy held off with just bashing that sex plot points over the head.
Yeah, that makes me think of Tristan calling her Mary and Lorelai having to explain the biblical insult to her. And then Paris echoes it later. She's like, Mary, you are such a prude, you know? It's sort of pointed out early on how uninterested Rory is. And she's contrasted against characters like Madeline and Louise, especially Louise being highly sexualized and just very much so boy crazy. They sort of stand in contrast to Paris and Rory, who are the good girls. Again, just that sort of like moralistic language used for the sexual behaviors and desires of minor girls. Just, ugh. But yeah, and just kind of going back to Lorelai and her teen pregnancy, I think they avoided the sex stuff as long as they did, simply because, you know, it was part of Rory's character and her arc that her mom's teen pregnancy left this like really deep, almost scar on her psyche in terms of, you know, I really do not want to be my mother. I am the white hope of the Gilmore clan. I cannot ruin my life. Boys will ruin my life. They will get me off track. You know, just, she can't help but hear stuff like when Strobe and Francine are in town and they're like, you know, your daughter ruined her life and took our son down with her. That impacts you, and it almost like makes you want to validate your own existence and prove everybody wrong that like you'd never fall into that trap. And so she probably suppresses a lot of her own sexuality and sexual desires because of all of that. And so she just sort of avoids it until she's 20, basically, which, you know, not an unreasonable age to have your first major sexual encounter. Totally fine. But it's more just like, I have to avoid this like the plague because I don't want to be accused of ruining my own life or ruining anyone else's life. I need to be the good girl. I need to stay on the correct path. And that requires purity and chastity.
Mm-hmm. I agree with all of that. I think it was also, you know, a lot of just Rory having her own aspirations in life and a career path that, you know, not that sex would derail from that, because it absolutely wouldn't, but if a child resulted from that, that she wasn't ready to, you know, birth into the world. And the show at this point really didn't talk about any of those other options other than like just deliver and have the kid, you know, that would really hinder anything that Rory wanted to do in her life, on top of her not being ready. But I also wanted to ask you, what do you think in terms of like, was it just, you know, Rory had aspirations that she didn't want to, you know, have diminished by a resulting child, or was she just also potentially really uneducated about everything?
That's a good question. I suppose that kind of brings up the topic of sex ed at Chilton, and what she knows. I mean, Rory is such a smart kid, and I'm sure she can find that kind of information on her own. And with her mom being as open and sort of liberal about it as she is, I don't think sexual or obscene materials would have been kept from her. I think Lorelai wanted her to go in knowledgeable and armed with that information so that she wouldn't make those mistakes. But Chilton, on the other hand, I have a hard time believing that a school that conservative would have a comprehensive relationship and sex education program. And, you know, it was probably very glossed over in health class. I'm picturing Mean Girls. Don't have sex because you will get gonorrhea and die.
Mm-hmm. Which is exactly how it works. And that's horrible too. I mean, unfortunately, Mean Girls is, and that scene is, you know, severe, just hyperbole. But I feel like there are probably some schools that unfortunately have instructors teaching health and sex ed incorrectly. And that's also, I think, a real danger, not just within a private school system, but even within a public school system, or even just parents that are sending their kids to religious institutions who are just teaching sex ed that's actually wrong information. And now that's even more dangerous to the child who's hearing all of this.
Yeah, it's not just incomplete, it's also incorrect. And it's, you know, sex ed should be evidence-based, not outrage-based. And I'm really proud of myself for coming up with that phrase. Someone else has probably already said it, but I like it. You know, I think we should be going based on what experts are saying. You know, there's a lot of good sexuality research out there now. There are good books and good research studies about what's actually the most helpful to kids. And it's not this whole like sheltering them from all talk of sex. Like, not talking about it is not going to solve the problem. You know, we live in such an erotophobic society, and it's not good to keep young people from this kind of information, because that's when they're the least prepared and the most confused. And so this is when you can get into problems with harassment, bullying, sexual violence. I don't even know if I can say that on YouTube. We're not monetized, so maybe it won't get flagged. But, you know, it's always abstinence only. You know, this is around the time that good old George W. Bush spent $1 billion with a B on abstinence only education. You know, this is the time period we're living in. And so is Mean Girls for that matter. But it's just, it's not helpful to ignore these things. Good sex ed is like teaching people not only the scientific functions, but also teaching them like about privacy and about bodily autonomy. It's usually too little, too late for kids to learn these things later into their teen years. And good sex ed is protective. It actually helps them make informed decisions about their sexual lives, and that's a good thing. Kids should be able to have privacy, bodily autonomy, self-determination. And, it's one of those things where sex ed is one of those topics that parents are most vocal about and they're most concerned about, but we don't let parents have as much control about any other topics their kids learn. And so it's just like, once again, we should have experts both in sexuality and pedagogy devising curricula that is age appropriate and informative and safe, because we can't assume that parents know everything or that what parents are teaching their kids is safe. Most abuse happens in the home, and without, the safe space of school, a lot of kids are left behind. And there's this, I really like this sort of, it's actually just an abstract of a longer article that I don't have access to because academic publications cost things and I don't always want to pay for full articles. But I really like this just sort of like abstract of this. It's an article by Michelle Fine. I forget the whole title of it. I can probably find it later. But Michelle Fine argues that the anti-sex rhetoric surrounding sex education and school-based health clinics does little to enhance the development of sexual responsibility and subjectivity in adolescence. Despite substantial evidence on the success of both school-based health clinics and access to sexuality information, the majority of public schools do not sanction or provide such information. And this is just public schools too. Like, you mentioned religious institutions. Ooh, this former Catholic schoolgirl has some things to say. As a result, female students, particularly low-income ones, suffer most from the inadequacies of present sex education policies. Current practices and language lead to increased experiences of victimization, teenage pregnancy, and increased dropout rates, and consequently combine to exacerbate the vulnerability of young women whom schools and the critics of sex education and school-based health clinics claim to protect. So it has this sort of counterintuitive outcome where, we're trying to protect girls, but instead of actually protecting them, we're sort of, we're bringing about the thing we sought to avoid by ignoring their experiences and reducing them to just don't do it.
Yeah. And it's, again, seriously very dangerous because sexual exploration within adolescence is going to happen. Every young person is going to hit that marker at a different stage in their life, but they're going to explore things within, the context of like their own body, exploring, what is acceptable and what they can do with other individuals that they're in relationships with, consensuality, what they like, what they don't like. But the lack of education doesn't mean that they won't explore. It just means that they're going to do it in a way that it can be really unhealthy and lead to some really disastrous results because they weren't given the information that they need to keep themselves safe, to keep partners safe. But it brings about the question, which I think, stems from, again, what Michelle says too. When should this sex education start? And who should have the final say? Should it be the schools that we're sending our kids to, or should it just be an at-home, the parents have the final word?
I mean, I would prefer it to come from schools because, again, these are the institutions we entrust the education of our children with, and we should trust them to provide things that are age appropriate and that are factually correct. And, also in general, not morally abhorrent. And, that brings in the whole, morality question as it pertains to sex and sort of the weird messed up ideas our society has about sex and shame. And it being an immoral activity and that you're bad for doing it. Very naughty. Innocence is good. Eroticism is bad. Women never experience desire. It's like this whole, set of moral imperatives that are especially forced on girls. And, and shame is used to control especially young girls. And so I would say that you know, it's best for it to come from schools because the information is objective and it's, you know, it doesn't come from a place of like a parent who's trying to keep things from their kid. And, you know, most parents aren't sex educators. Leave it to the professionals, guys. Like, I know you might have some ideas about like not wanting your kids to know too much, but sometimes the more they know, the better, you know, then they're able to better protect themselves from these things. And they don't view or don't come to view sex as a site of danger or disempowerment. And they can actually make informed decisions about what's best for themselves outside of, you know, what are potentially your messed up ideals about love and sex. But the problem is, you know, obviously a lot of curriculums come down from the government, and government is increasingly controlled and influenced by the Christian conservative right, especially the far right, the anti-trans, anti-gay Christian right has just a disproportionate amount of control because their voices are the loudest and most vehement about no sex in schools. And as you said, it doesn't actually protect them from any of it. They're going to explore regardless. And if they do explore it, then they're going to be left with feelings of guilt and shame that are also psychologically damaging. And it's not good for anyone to live under that kind of environment. Like, purity culture is really messed up. And, you know, I encourage people to go online and find good information about the psychological damage that purity culture can bring about. And we'll talk about it a little bit with Lane later. But yeah, so on the one hand, government controls schools, and government is heavily influenced by the Christian right, even in a country that purports to have a separation of church and state. But also parents are usually not equipped to provide the right information or answer these questions. And so teachers need to be better prepared and better informed about all of this themselves, and go with what the evidence and the research shows is good for teenagers. And that brings me to One's Got Class and the Other One Dies, where Lorelai, yeah, yeah, go off, girlfriend, on what happens there, because with the slut shaming already.
Lorelai did nothing wrong. She was fielding questions from students that were just being thrown at her without any preparation, without any expectation that was going to be asked of her. She was trying to give her presentation. The second that they glom onto the fact that you were a 16-year-old mother, I want to know more about it. And it strikes me because I think these kids were asking so many questions because they were not getting sex education, perhaps even from Stars Hollow High, or, you know, the Karens and their moms were just like, we're never going to talk about it ever because you're just not going to be having sex, right? Like, that's not even a discussion that needs to be had. I'm sure you don't have any desires. I'm sure you don't have any feelings. We're just going to avoid it like the plague. So I feel like Lorelai was on the receiving end of all of it because these kids have been told nothing and they need to know, and they're desperate for that knowledge. It shouldn't be coming from Lorelai, and certainly not in that moment in that way. But she did the best she could to just say, hey, this is the truthful reality of what I went through. You know, here are some little tidbits of knowledge that I can impart on you before, you know, I get slaughtered by the Karens of the town. Butch Danes, everybody.
Yeah. Oh, it was so rough to watch. And, you know, Debbie's whole tack was like, fend them off, change the subject. And Lorelai was like, look, I wasn't actually advocating anything to them. I was just telling them about my experience. You're acting like I walked into the room and tossed condoms in the air. And she's right, you know. She's being unfairly crucified for saying anything about teenage sexuality. And, you know, it wasn't even advocacy or activism or anything. All she said was like, yeah, I was 16 when I got pregnant. And, you know, don't have sex. Like, if you should even be having sex. She's just as flustered as everyone else. But, you know, Debbie was just kind of sitting there, like, staring in judgment. And I love how Lorelai responded, you know, with the whole, like, next time I'll bring a banana and we'll have a little show and tell. How about that?
Yeah.
And of course, they're like, what kind of mother are you? And I love her response to this so much. And I think that this needs to be sort of like the guiding principle. It's like the kind of mom who doesn't gloss over things just because they're a little uncomfortable. And I think it's one of the areas of motherhood where Lorelai truly shines. Even when she doesn't love something for Rory, she's never judgmental about it. She doesn't gloss over it. She wants to be in the know. She wants Rory to be able to tell her anything. And she works at maintaining that level of relationship, even if she doesn't necessarily personally agree with all of Rory's choices.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have to echo that. Lorelai did really well, especially when down the line, and we'll get to it too, Rory has sexual encounters that, should never have occurred. And Lorelai is right there to call her out on her BS and just be like, do you see how you're behaving right now? Why these sexual choices that you're making are actually no longer appropriate or are good for any parties involved? Every step of the way, as Rory is, moving into adulthood too, and we'll talk about it more in that episode, part 2, and then, part 3 when we get there. But she keeps Rory in check and balanced when she's making good and wise choices and, highlighting them. And then when she makes bad choices, she says she's right there to be like, you just messed up and you need to recognize why these choices and these sexual encounters and what you're doing with other people are now no longer okay. It's not one or the other. She's just very even-keeled with Rory. And I love that she does it well because we'll get into talking about it. And I kind of want to move us there. Emily Gilmore failed.
Yeah, it's true. Emily does, in fact, fail. This is kind of jumping quite ahead in time to season 6 when she finds out about Rory's sexuality and she resorts to manipulation and shame and efforts to control Rory's sexuality that go to the point of essentially locking her out of her own home and putting her in the room next door so that she can monitor her and make sure that she's not having sex with her loving, loyal, committed boyfriend of 6 months. And I really hate that whole plot line. Oh, I mean, I love it because it's hilarious when Reverend Boatwright comes to dinner and it's just like, your virtue is a gift. You can't re-gift it. It's just like the whole thing is absurd and hilarious. And it's like, yeah, the gift ship has sailed. It's probably in Fiji by now. Just this assumption that this 21-year-old girl is still chaste and perfect and angelic, and that having sex makes her not those things. That it, the conversation that Lorelai has with Richard in his study while he's moping during her birthday party, and he's like, I gave her everything she needed to throw her life away. And I'm like, that's not what this is about, Richard. You can't boil this all down to her sexual immorality. Get out of here. Like, I can't with you. I want to punch you in the face right now. Oh, the whole thing was just like hilarious and absurd and just very troubling that, but it's a big part of the environment that Emily grew up in herself and sort of a big portion of the conservative ideals about what a good society looks like and therefore what a good woman looks like. And that's, a married one who waits until marriage to have sex and then has lots of babies. So, Rory's not exactly living up to that ideal for them, and it's troubling to them, and therefore it makes them feel, or it gives them flashbacks to the way they felt with Lorelai throwing her life away, and what that means to them versus what it meant to her, and what life is supposed to look like, what the proper thing to do is.
Which there is no proper way to go about it. I mean, again, that's what's always got me about Emily and Richard. And again, contrasting too, I think it was a lot of flashback to Lorelai, but I think there was no betterment there for them with Rory. They just instantly were like, we're going to try and clamp her down and shut this down for her in the same way that we never could with Lorelai. We don't want to see her make those same mistakes, ruin her life, have a baby that, she is not ready for. Again, with zero regard to any other viable options, which are out there and exist. And I mean, even with Rory, like, and it wasn't even just them saying like, oh, have sex, but have sex responsibly. Have you gone to a gynecologist? Are you, have you had communication with your partner about STDs to make sure that they're clean, to make sure that you stay healthy? It's just, just don't have sex ever again. Why are we falling back on that? I can't.
Yeah. And, it makes me think of the other component of their sort of ideas about women, girls, appropriate life, debutante balls, and just sort of how they're basically a meat market for virgins. Like, I'm young and of marriageable age and of good breeding, like literally talking about women as property, as chattels to be traded in transactions between fathers and husbands, and just the problematic stuff that has come about from that for the last several thousand years. 10,000, 13,000, something like that. Ever since agriculture was invented, and we're like, what's important? Property. And what's important is having an economic relationship with our neighbor next door so that we can join our farms and we can make more money and we can continue our line. And the purity of that line and the name is very important. Yeah.
Even that, and like just the whole concept of like dowries for women when they're being married off. Like, I'd want to throw up right now.
I know. See the visceral reaction to the word dowry. I'm like, ugh.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yikes. So that's a whole thing unto itself. But going back in time a little bit, I want to have another season 3 conversation. Speaking of Lorelai and her reactions to Rory's sexuality, the one that stands out to me is in the big one, when she overhears Paris and Rory talking about Paris's sexual encounter with Jamie, and her being like, I've got the good kid. And just the moralizing of Rory's purity as making her superior to Paris, and the whole discourse around all of that. And so that kind of brings me to Paris. How do you feel about that conversation that Paris had with Rory in her bedroom, and just like her whole reaction to, the aftermath of sex with Jamie?
I will just start it off by saying, pack your chastity belt, Gilmore, you're going to Harvard. Like, what Lorelai does to Rory in that moment, even if Rory doesn't overhear it, by saying like, oh, I've got the good kid, and saying like, she's holier than thou because she hasn't, bedded a man yet or slept with anybody. And then having that directly paralleled with Paris saying like, I had sex, but I'm not going to Harvard. One equates to the other. There's a lot of similarity and overlap there, because Paris is diminishing herself and her own value, saying, well, now that I've been with a man and like I'm getting caught up in my feelings and it's keeping me from my studies, and all of this is unfolding, this is what is disallowing me to gain admission to the school that I want to go to. That's why Rory got in, because she's not, there's no convolution there. Like, she's not distracted by sex and partnerships and feelings, but it doesn't make Rory a better person. And so now you have Lorelai putting her daughter up on this pedestal once again, which never happens in the show ever. And Paris just no one else was doing it. She was doing it to herself. She's like, I'm just completely taking myself off this pedestal because I effed up, and it's because I was having these encounters and these relations. Oh boy, that's just so wrong to equate sex and failure in that way.
Yeah. The psychological turmoil it causes for her because she hasn't been emotionally prepared for it. It's so sad. And you're right. She does it to herself. She is internalizing the shame that the society has told her she should be feeling for embracing sexuality. And, when she first starts dating Jamie, it's like the first time she's ever late to school that we can tell. Like, she shows up late and she's like, sorry, it'll never happen again. It's sort of like foreshadowing of Jamie throwing her off her path a little bit. And just the way that she ties up her ideas of self-worth with academics and conflates not getting into Harvard, like the loss of her virtue is the loss of her value. So it's so sad that she does it to herself, because Rory wasn't judging her. I don't even think Lorelai was judging her. I think Lorelai was reacting to the whole like, okay, I have nothing to worry about in terms of like Rory getting off track or Rory getting into something that maybe she's not ready for yet. Even Lauren Graham hated that line and was like pushing against it, apparently. Just her reaction was sort of out of character for her, and it was gross, but it comes from a place of, again, the internalized sexual mores that purity culture puts in place. And so it's nice to see Paris looking to Rory for support, because I don't think she really has it anywhere else. Madeline and Louise are far more sexually experienced and therefore may not be as helpful to Paris, because they may be a little more judgmental about like, well, why'd it take you so long? I don't think they would be judgmental in the sense of like, oh my God, you're a slut. Paris does that to herself. Again, very sad. And clearly Paris's home life is not supportive, because we see, she says in the next episode when Rory comes to talk to her, she's like, so I told my mom about Jamie, and then she just told me that my father hasn't pleased her in 15 years. Like, I couldn't tell.
Yeah, and the thing with Paris there is that, you're right, had she gone to Madeline and Louise, they would have just been like, spill it thy tea. Like, give us all of the crude and juicy details of the encounter itself. Like, how was Jamie? And that's not what Paris needed in that moment in time. She was just, I think, needing validation that like the choice that she had made was actually okay. And it was. Like, she was just needing someone to tell her, like, it's okay that you had sex. And I think that's what she needed to hear. And that's what Rory did for her in that moment. And Rory asked a lot of really good questions. She's like, was everything essentially above board? Were you safe? Did Jamie, not do anything that made you feel uncomfortable? Like, was everything okay? And at the end of it, when Paris was like, yes to all of those things, and actually it was really, really nice and a good experience. And Rory was just like, okay, so you're good then. Like, congratulations. Like, not that she said that, but I think it was just Paris needing to know, like, I had sex and you know what? It's okay.
Yeah, truly one of Rory's best moments, I think. But you hit the nail on the head, just in terms of like the questions that Rory were asking were the right ones, in terms of like, were you safe? Was he good to you? Are you all right? Just nailed it. That was the good part. And then they kind of ruin it with Lorelai equating Rory's worth to her sexuality as well, being like, my kid's good because she hasn't had sex. It's a little weird, but I just, Rory's support and reaction to Paris was top notch, both in her room and after Paris's meltdown in public, which was, oh God, her publicly shaming herself was at once, again, I've said this before, at once one of the funniest moments, just in terms of Liza Wiles' delivery of the whole thing, but also one of the saddest, that she's internalizing these unhelpful and misogynistic ideas about sexuality and what that means, and equating it with her value to an institution like Harvard. She says she's being punished, but she's the one punishing herself. Harvard has nothing to do with this. It's all coming from within her, and that's the hardest part to reckon with. And it's one of the things that makes the show so weird on the sex front, because, on the one hand, we have sex positive Lorelai and some really great healthy messages about sexuality. And then we have moments like this where, the success and accomplishments of women are tied to their sexuality and their sexual decisions. And, there are more examples of this that I would like to get to. So how about we move on to Rory and Dean?
Have at it, girl.
Yeah. So I find it interesting that Rory waits another whole year to, I guess I understand. I think it was absolutely done for a purpose. But, she waits another whole year to have sex for the first time. And she does it with someone who's supposed to make her feel safe, but in reality has lied to her. And, that's some pretty dubious consent right there. Do you think she would have said yes if she knew that the marriage wasn't exactly as over as Dean said it was?
That is a good question. I still think, unfortunately, our girl Rory might have still messed up a little bit and gone ahead anyway, because I feel like Dean probably would have still been like spinning a web of like, well, it's not legally over yet, but like we're done. And I think if that's the response that, you know, was continuing to be perpetuated, that Rory still would have just been like, well, yeah, this is probably still okay, because even though like the legal, you know, marriage is still in place, like, you know, if he's telling me that like he's emotionally, physically, everything like just checked out, like my Dean now, and it's like, nope, still not okay, Rory. Like, so yeah, I think I want to. I would be nice to be able to give Rory a little bit more credit there, but I just don't think that I can.
Yeah, they seemed pretty wrapped up in it. It was probably going to end up that way regardless. But, you know, it contrasts heavily to season 1 where they fall asleep at Miss Patty's. And then, you know, Rory gets chewed out for that. And then, you know, 4 years later, they return to that spot and do it again. Only this time they actually do it. I want to talk about full circle moments. There's one. Oh, and the other like interesting full circle moment is that the Candyman song she puts on postcoital is from Willy Wonka, which is the movie they watched when Dean first came over to the house. So that's interesting.
Also a bit of nightmare fuel, but I won't go there.
Yes, that's true. It was a very awkward and uncomfortable moment for everyone to witness that. Especially because just like a few episodes earlier, we had heard Taylor Dosey singing that song. I guess it was like a season earlier, but like when he sings that for the opening of his soda shot. Oh, I can't with that. Yeah, but obviously this is not the ideal situation in which one wants to have their first sexual encounter, because just all the emotional manipulation involved is going to leave a mark for Rory now. And you see their revived relationship in season 5 is not going well. You know, they keep facing all of these obstacles, and Rory runs off to Europe and comes back and regrets having a summer where she's not focused on her career. You know, once again, a guy can like knocks her off the path and gets in the way of her educational and professional advancement because she didn't take any jobs or internships over the summer. She didn't work on her writing. She was just so wrapped up in her own stuff that, you know, there's proof positive that sex will derail you entirely. And then it only gets better when he breaks up with her again and she writes, you know, the article about the Life and Death Brigade. It's like, oh, finally the scales of the universe have been rebalanced. She's finally focusing on journalism and not on Dean, and you know, the universe is keeping them apart. So that's something. And then you get later on with Logan, and you know, she starts dating Logan right before she drops out of Yale. A lot of people sort of credit him with her downfall, which I don't think is entirely fair. Again, I don't necessarily see it being, well, it's semi-related because she gets professional criticism from her boyfriend's dad, but it still comes down to her burnout and her professional life going up in flames in her own eyes. It's not so much Logan's behavior toward her as the general context from which it comes. But, you know, she sort of like breaks up with Logan, and then all of a sudden, boom, she's back at Yale and she has a job, and her and her mom are back together again. And
yeah, there's a lot of, I don't even know how I would phrase it. Just misconstrued rhetoric about how sex just, you know, again, will derail your life, like you said. It will not. You'll be okay. And again, just that's the validation that Paris needed in the moment with Rory. I think that's what Rory also needed to, and probably still needs to learn, that like it's not one or the other. Like you can have both. Like you can have a career path and a job and an education and like an educational background and a loving and healthy relationship with a partner. Like it's not going to be, you know, pick A or B, the red pill or the blue pill.
Yeah, red pillars. There's an interesting conversation that we're not going to have right now. But yeah, there's just this energy around anytime she's with a guy, whether it's coming from herself, the writers, or the other characters in reaction to her. It's just so like catastrophic. It's like, oh my God, like Rory's interested in a boy. Like, what's going to happen here? You know, it really starts with Dean and Lorelai's initial reaction to him. Also, Mrs. Kim is really slut-shamey about finding out about her kiss too. It's just like, oh, so judgmental from her. But you know,
I'm sorry, go ahead. I kind of want to bring us there though too, because you know, we haven't gotten to Lane yet. I want to talk about her, but just going back to even how Rory can think like, you know, one man might ruin your life. Imagine having two in the same calendar year.
Oh my God. Just it's unthinkable that she could possibly have two sexual partners. We'll get there. That's more of like a part 2 conversation.
Yeah.
But for the time being,
I just had to throw it in.
Yeah. We'll have a more fulsome conversation with that in next week's episode. So come back for that. But yeah, it's just, you know, the whole idea that like she's less of a mess when guys aren't involved. You know, the minute she breaks up with someone, things are great, you know? Even in the revival, the minute she breaks off her affair with Logan, it's smooth sailing for her memoir. Like suddenly she's no longer distracted by this affair, and she can just outline the first several chapters of a book within a couple of days and magically fix things with Lorelai. But then, as we all know, she is saddled with the ultimate long-term consequence of sex in the fact that she is now pregnant. And so, full freaking circle much. It's so bizarro how the show treats sex in Rory's life, and like how she's such a mess when she's with guys, but then when she's not, like everything's hunky-dory. We get very little, like I think season 4 is really the only time she's truly single, and then everybody just keeps pointing out how she's single, and that's somehow a bad thing.
Yeah.
And then that
like the desperation, it's like you can just smell it on her.
Yeah.
And it's like, no, again, I won't even go off on that because we don't have the time, and I would be here for another half hour. But it's okay to be single too. Like, and just to have, you know, then it's just like, oh, well, now she's not successful because she doesn't have a man or a partner in her life, and she's focusing on those other things. It's like, but then you shame her for when she does have relations and it, you know, takes her away from her studies. Like, it's such a conflicting message. Which one is it?
Yeah, the whole show is like one big conflicting message about everything. It doesn't know what it wants to be sometimes. And yeah, it's really problematic that they connect Rory's accomplishments and her mental stability to not being with a guy, especially when so much focus is on her relationships the whole time. You know, she goes from Dean to Jess to desperate singledom to Logan, and then is with Logan for like 3 years. And, you know, so much of the time she is with a boy, but anytime sex gets involved, things get very messy. I mean, Jess in Keg Max, the party episode, Dean and the cheating, Logan and the dropping out of Yale, Logan and the revival, it all just comes back to, you know, yeah, you're better off with celibacy, Rory. Like, you're better off alone. Don't even bother with men, because what do you need them for? It doesn't really show us a healthy version of sexuality for Rory. Like, I think there's a brief window when she is dating Logan. That is absolutely her best, most stable relationship. And her sexual relationship with Logan actually seems pretty solid when they're not sniping at each other or going behind each other's backs, especially like her with Jess and Philly. It seems like they're both consenting, loving, committed, and healthy in that relationship. And it's the only time we ever see it. And just the rest of the time, it's a disaster for everyone.
Yeah. What do you think? I mean, though, having her first encounter with Dean in that way, like, do you think it stunted her sex life for the rest of her life in any way?
I don't think so, because she fairly quickly rebounds, feels like the wrong word, but like you know, she doesn't take all that long to get into a relationship with Logan. And I think that experience opened her up a little bit. It was sort of one of those things of like, well, okay, now I know what this looks like for me and what I'm comfortable with. And I have some experience to work with. And it allowed her to explore a little bit more with Logan. Logan is a very different kind of person to anyone she's ever been with before, in the sense that he is comfortable with his sexuality. He is quote unquote promiscuous. He has a line of girls out the door ready to sleep with him. And so it's a very different experience for her to go into a relationship with someone like that and have it be casual and learn how to, control her emotions when it comes to jealousy and all of those kinds of things. Although she doesn't really do a good job with it, as we can see. It doesn't go well for her. But at least she tried it. She was open to examining what it would look like for her to have sexual intimacy without having emotional intimacy. And she found she didn't like it. And you know what? That's fine. I think plenty of people go through that phase in their 20s where they're like, ooh, I really don't like the whole like casual thing. I much prefer to be in a romantic commitment. And that's all right. So I don't necessarily think it stunted her. I think there were a lot of other things that stunted her in terms of just the early expectations for her life and her bizarre commitment to a profession that she probably wasn't going to be all that good at long term. We'll get to that when we talk about journalism. And the way people put her on a pedestal as always being perfect, and how that led to, again, catastrophizing when anything went wrong for her. And maybe that's what makes it look like the guys are what's quote unquote ruining her life.
Okay, right. I'm sorry. I just, like, the brain vomit just gagged me with all of it. I can't. Take me somewhere else right now, please.
Oh gosh. I suppose we could go to Lane in terms of like her sort of unexpected virginity pact with herself and her mom and God. Just in terms of her sense of virtue and value coming out in unexpected ways when it comes to Zach in season 5.
Mm-hmm. Let me start by asking you this. Do you ever foresee a scenario where Lane would have, taken what her mom said, no to sex until marriage? She internalized that, and then she brought that into her relationship with Zach, and they have that very, just, I don't know, bleak sort of discussion about how, like, he knows, like, oh, I'm not going to get any tonight, but now I'm not going to get any until we're married. And she's kind of just like, yeah, I guess. Like, could you ever have foreseen Lane just being like, actually, I'm going to just toss that out the window. Let's go.
That's such a hard one. Pun not intended. Euphemism not intended. Hey-o. There's going to be a lot of that happening in these episodes, I think. I'm surprised it took me this long to make one of those, but I can't really see her throwing it out the window because she was always just so forbidden to be even a remotely sexual being. She couldn't even decide who she wanted to date herself. It was always sort of like dictated by her mom, and her mom's values were so ingrained in her, as were society's values, frankly. I think it wasn't just her mom, but just, the discourse around young girls at the time in terms of not being a slut and that being the absolute worst thing you can do or be. So I think all of these things were so internalized and so repressed in her that she like didn't even know exactly how to be a sexual being. And this is why we see her have the sort of like breakdown that she does in season 6 and 7, which we'll get to. Yeah, so that's a whole thing. But you know what? I actually think that might be a good place to stop, because we have more to say about Lane in the vein of her marriage and her early sex life with Zach. And it feels like a conversation for part 2, unless there's anything else you want to say about
if you start letting me go off on that right now, again, will go long. We're trying to, keep these a little more concise these days. So I will save all of those thoughts for part 2. I think that is a good place to kick off that next episode.
Yeah, we got to leave you on a little bit of a cliffhanger. So you'll have to come back next week and see what else we have to say about, Lane waiting till her wedding night and the conversation she has with her mom and the honeymoon in Mexico. And we're not going to stop there, obviously. There's a lot more to say. So next week is going to be sort of a focus on adult sexuality and sex positivity on the show. We're going to sort of like have a little bit more conversation about the other adults on the show: Suki, Emily, Richard, Lorelai, Paris's later sex life, male promiscuity coming from our guys, and a little bit of conversation about the representation or lack thereof of any other types of sexuality on the show. And I think it's going to be a good conversation.
Indeed, it will be. Come back and join us for that. In the meantime, if you want more content, go back and watch some of our old episodes. Keep binging Gigi, because why should you ever stop? And just as always, please remember to do all those YouTube things for us. Please like this video, subscribe to our channel, share it with your friends who love the show as much as we do, and leave us a comment if you have thoughts about, how sexuality was seen with the teenagers on the show. If you have any things that you would want us to address moving forward, we'd love to hear your thoughts as well.
Yeah. Definitely drop us your hot takes in the comments below.
Mm-hmm.
And on that note, we will see you next Friday for dinner.
Take care, y'all.
Bye.